Thank you. It's really great to be in this space because 10 years ago when In the Heart of the Sea had just come out, I was here when I first heard that book hit the bestseller list. And it was, so I love you guys, I love this store, and it really is a thrill to be back. Now, I am known primarily for books about the sea, but long before I moved to Nantucket Island back in 1986, I was a 14-year-old high school freshman in that maritime center of the universe, Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. And it was in Pittsburgh when I went to the movies and I saw Little Big Man. Oh my gosh, I can still remember, everything of that 2 hours. I remember, Dustin Hoffman, the whole Custer as a deranged maniac. It was just terrific. It blew the back of my head off, and I became completely fascinated with this Custer, the whole Sitting Bull thing, the whole Battle of the Little Bighorn. What was this all about? And in the 1980s, when Son of the Morning Star came out, the great book by Evan Cannell, which really introduced me to the nooks and crannies of this incredibly complex, nuanced story, I began to think, boy, I'd really like to return to that someday. And then it was in 2006 when I was finishing Mayflower. And in that book, I write about the iconic event that many Americans associate with the beginning of this country, the Pilgrims and the voyage of the Mayflower. And with that book, I realized that the story doesn't end with the first Thanksgiving. I took it to the next generation, when 50 years later, a horrible English native conflict erupted in New England, known as King Philip's War, a war about which many Americans know nothing. And we think of the Civil War as the bloodiest war ever fought in American soil, and it was certainly where the most people died. But when you look at the percentage of population killed, King Philip's War was even worse, in fact, twice as deadly. And after finishing that, I said, okay, so this is my take on the iconic beginning. Where does this process lead? Where does the push west across this continent ultimately lead in an iconic sense? It leads to the Battle of the Little Bighorn. And so I finally got up the courage to try to tackle this event that turned Custer and Sitting Bull into American icons. And one of the arguments in my previous books was that we Americans are infatuated with a sense of the wilderness, the frontier. It's how we define ourselves. It's how we're different from all those other nations. And my argument in the other three books was that we all know about the American West, but long before there was the cowboy and Indians resonating in the mythic imagination of America, there was the wilderness of the sea. And in fact, throughout the first half of the 19th century, it was the sea where Americans and whale ships were going to all the corners of the seven seas, where China traders were going into the exotic Far East. And this was the process by which America was really beginning to emerge as a world power. And with this book, I wanted to trace the continuities between the wilderness of the West and the wilderness of the sea. And I have to say, after 4 years of research and writing, I know I at least have come to feel that this book isn't a departure for me. It has felt a lot more like a culmination, because as soon as I got out to the south central Montana in 2006, I felt this oceanic sense of vastness. The big sky is very much like being at sea, and none other than Custer, in his book My Life on the Plains, would compare the rolling green of the plains in Kansas to stationary waves. It's a version of reality that seems to really persist across the sea to the terrestrial interior of this country. Now, the Battle of the Little Bighorn is really three battles in one. When Custer's Crow Scouts first sighted evidence of a huge Lakota and Cheyenne village under Sitting Bull, in dawn hours of June 25, 1876, they were up on the Wolf Mountains, about 15 miles to the east of the Little Bighorn Valley. Because of the intervening bluffs, they could not see the village directly, but they could see smoke coming up into the morning air, and they could see evidence of a huge pony herd, as many as 20,000 horses ranging up and down the valley. They felt this was all the evidence they needed, that there were a large number of Indians down in the Little Bighorn Valley. Custer was initially skeptical, but by the time some Lakota and Cheyenne were spotted and it was realized that the soldiers had been seen and the element of surprise was no longer there, Custer decided to attack whatever was down there. Now, a cavalry officer in the West in the 1876 was most concerned not by the size of the village. It was that the village would disperse before they could attack it. They used the term scatteration. Lakota and Cheyenne were so mobile that if they were given even a moment's head start, a village could fragment and seemed like an instant, and there would be nothing for the military to attack. So that was Custer's biggest concern. And as they made their way into the valley, his scouts said that yes, this looked like that was indeed the case. The village was beginning to fragment. As a consequence, Custer divided his regiment of about 650 soldiers into 3 battalions. He led a battalion of about 210 soldiers. His second in command, Major Marcus Reno, had a slightly smaller battalion, and his senior captain, Frederick Benteen, took another battalion. Benteen swung left. Reno was ordered to charge down the Little Bighorn Valley toward the still unseen village, and it would be Custer and his 210 men who would probably first get a clear view of the village. They would swing right up into the bluffs that overlook this portion of the valley. And we know from a messenger that he would soon send to Benteen and his battalion to come on quick, big village, that he was exultant when he first got a glimpse of this huge village that was not dispersing. It was sitting there in the valley. Custer took off his hat, waved it in the air, and said, "Hurrah, boys, we've got them. They're sleeping in their teepees. Well, this will be over quick and we'll be on our way back to our station." They would continue north over an intervening bluff and never be seen alive again by the rest of the regiment, because some of Reno's men, as they were charging down that valley towards the village, saw Custer waving his hat. Now, it wasn't until he was right on the village that Reno caught a glimpse of this village, and he was ordered to charge into it. But he saw enough evidence that it was pretty big and perhaps there was a trap that he stopped, threw out a skirmish line, and instead of charging in, paused, and the men began to fire ineffectually towards this village that was still several hundred yards away. As it turned out, Sitting Bull, who was a Hunkpapa Lakota, was in the village to the south, right there when Reno attacked. And one of the great surprises I had in my research was to learn that when the first bullets were beginning to fly, Sitting Bull's initial response was not to attack in kind, but because Reno had stopped to throw out that skirmish line, he wondered if these soldiers might want to negotiate instead of fight. He would tell his nephew, One Bull, take his rifle, give One Bull his own shield and say, see if they want to negotiate. One Bull would approach the skirmish line, the bullets would continue to fly, one of his best friends would get a bullet through the hips, and it was clear that negotiation was not an option. Only then did Sitting Bull say, okay, let's attack. And it would be Crazy Horse who would really take over and be one of the leading leaders when it came to the actual fighting of the Battle of Little Bighorn. He would slow the young warriors down as the soldiers were firing indiscriminately away, and eventually lead a charge that would send Reno's troops reeling. They would retreat in chaos. No effort was made to cover this retreat, go across the river and up onto a bluff to the south. By this time, Benteen, who had gotten that note to come on quick, was making his way towards Custer. Reno and Benteen did not like Custer. Custer was a lightning rod. You either loved him or you hated him, and these two men hated him. And Benteen was doing everything he could to dawdle, even though that message had said to come on quick. Reno would say, my God, I've lost half my command. Stay with me here for a while. They would dawdle for about an hour until a younger officer would shame them into going north up to that bluff known as Weir Peak and look to the north. In the distance, about 3 miles away, was a huge dust and smoke cloud. They could see hundreds, perhaps thousands of warriors. but they weren't sure what was going on. And then they saw this huge amount of warriors come towards them like a human tidal wave, and they realized that they were in trouble and they needed to go for ground where they could defend themselves. They would retreat several miles to the south and then would begin one of the great sieges of the American West.